Дуже дякую. Thank you for this invitation, Alla and Mikola. And thank you everyone for being here today. I want to begin by talking about Ukraine and maps. In times of war, every map becomes a weapon. You need maps desperately right now to see where the enemy troops are stationed. Maps are useful for helping you gather together. You assemble against threats that no one in America can quite comprehend. But I am not here to tell you how to make choices. You live in a sovereign, independent Ukraine. The lines drawn around Ukraine are drawn by Ukrainians. The revisionism, territorial revisionism, irredentism is drawn by Mr. Putin. In this sense, maps lie. Maps in a time of war can kill us. The great French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, post-structuralist critic, once said, maps precede territory. And so what I want to talk about now is how maps are dangerous. Maps indicate power. Maps show patterns of development, patterns of unity. I want to talk about the territories and lands of Ukraine, the lands I first learned: Transcarpathia, Halichina, Volhynia, Podolia, left and right bank Kiev, Chernihiv, Sloboda Ukraina, Bukovina, Donbass, Crimea, Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, Kherson, Mariupol, Sumy, Zhytomyr, Chernihiv, Izum, Hostomel, Melitopol, Berdyansk, Irpin, Poltava, Luhansk, Bucha, Lviv, Borodyanka. Your city, Kherson, is still free. I want to think about how geography matters, because Kherson can be mapped into many different histories. This idea that Mr. Putin has about history is easily disproven by any professional historian. The Kremlin speaks about territory as myth. As a scholar, I tend to follow the world of national self-determination after World War I in context. I study national self-determination. The world of 1919 and 1918, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, is my starting point for understanding colonialism, imperialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-colonialism. The person you see in this slide was a Canadian who became American, Isaiah Bowman. He was the president of Johns Hopkins University. Bowman worked for President Woodrow Wilson. This next slide tells us the importance of lines and borders on maps. These type of maps, which became very popular after 1848 in the Russian Empire and Habsburg Empire, are incredibly valuable for Ukrainian history, maps of ethnic territories. The problem with these maps, with their colors and lines, is that they tend to erase people. The map at the left was the first ethnographic map of Европейская Россия, in Russian, по-русски, map of European Russia. The map at the right, drawn after 1848 by Karl Freiherr von König, was a map indicating ethnic demography to Vienna. Why is this important? It's important because if you read in English, maps reduce populations to ethnic categories. When maps reduce entire populations, millions of people, to ethnic categories, those maps erase human choices and human agency. And so what I want to argue today is that cartography is actually very dangerous and very misleading because it is a weapon and a tool of empires. Mr. Putin, unfortunately, does not read the kind of scholarship we have produced in Ukrainian studies since 1973 at Harvard. Nor, I'm afraid, do Russian colonial and imperial historians put into context Ukraine's recent contemporary suchastny historia. I want to emphasize the importance of Ukraine's independent history and civic identity and civic project of democracy since 1991. This civic project of democracy, for what Americans know about democracy, involves the use of maps for things like gerrymandering, cracking, packing, hijacking, kidnapping, carving lands. This is very important to understand because Ukraine's history is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, and multi-confessional. It does not reduce to Ukrainians and Russians. This is probably the most important geographer and cartographer of Ukraine, Stepan Rudnitsky. He was important as a person born in Halichina, Galicia, Lviv, Lviv, Lemberg, Leopold, because he spoke multiple languages. He was a scientist, and he studied German geography as well as Polish geography in order to draw the first maps of Ukraine in Ukrainian. You will notice from this map, which was drawn during World War I, that it depicts in pink the color of the British Empire, British pink possessions, territories of Ukraine. Rudnitsky was a supporter of a Ukrainian republic, independent Ukraine. The way Rudnitsky thought about Ukraine and Ukrainians was in terms of what Ukrainians wanted in their voice, in their native voice. And Rudnitsky and his school of geographers, who eventually moved to Prague and then eventually to Kharkiv, emphasized the importance of creating an independent nation at the intersection of empires. In this sense, Rudnitsky followed from the history of the Greek Catholic and Galician Ukrainian intelligentsia since the 1830s and 1840s. He followed the history of the Ukrainian national intelligentsia, nation builders. So let me go through some of the maps and then I'll stop and make a few more comments. So visually, these were very important to the history of Ukraine in the diaspora. These included geographers and ethnographers such as Volodymyr Kubiyovich. So Kubiovich was a person who worked during World War II in Poland, and he became an exile in Canada. This is a very complicated issue because it is an issue of collaboration between the Nazi government and between the Ukrainian government from 1941 to 1944. So this is one of the reasons why you hear from the Kremlin the languages of genocide, right? The discourse of genocide and Nazis and denazificatia. But let me make a few more points. This argument is in many ways a captive to the history of the Russian and Soviet nationalist and Soviet Russian version of World War II. In the Ukrainian diaspora in North America during the Cold War, Ukraina, the idea of Ukraina back to early modern periods, the Cossacks, was revived as a moment to emphasize the collective importance of Ukrainian identity. So let me turn now to the history as I think it should be written in terms of the frames of reference, Timothy Snyder, Serhiy Plokhy, scholars I deeply respect and admire in Ukrainian history and Ukrainian studies. I wrote about this idea of geopolitics and geopolitica as the way the Kremlin responded to Euromaidan. I have an article about this, which I gave to Alla and Nicola, which you can read. But I want to talk a little bit about how the Western media is trapped in many ways by maps in Mr. Putin's world, Ruski Mir. Наприклад, these maps were drawn during Майдан Незалежності. These maps were drawn by cartographers and graphic arts designers for major American and North American newspapers. You will notice in looking at these maps how they use ethnic categories to divide populations. What is interesting about these maps as they appear is that they were drawn from the internet. They were drawn from Wikipedia. The source for a lot of these maps of division was the 2001 Ukrainian census. And so there were different ways of representing Ukraine and Ukrainians, but unfortunately, Ukrainian choices and different groups were not represented. For example, all of the different populations which complement and constitute your democracy, Tatars, Poles, Armenians, Chechens, Afghanis, Georgians, Swedes, Finns, all of these people who are fighting against Russia during the war, many of them, Muslims, Tatari, Christians, Jews, these are largely silenced in these maps. And so this is a very big problem, which has continued through the 8-year war that you have fought against in Ukraine, that Ukrainians have fought from 2014. So just to give you some idea of what I've researched in Suchasna Historia, in the last 8 years, I gave a lecture in Berlin in 2016, in which I explained to Germans how these maps were misleading. And the reason for this was because many Germans focused on Nord Stream 2, right, on pipelines, or Americans in their outlets, especially the realist school of political science, John Mearsheimer, for example, many focused on the idea that Russia was a great power. Rosja ta velika держава. Tak jest. So this was the problem for Ukraine, right? Because if you reduce geopolitics to these type of maps, you accept the idea that Russia is a G8 or G7 or G3, a velika держава. I started with the argument that maps lie. What maps don't tell us, for example, is that 73% of your population in 2019 voted for Zelensky Volodymyr. 73% voted for a Jewish president, which is probably unprecedented in any country in the world. And in this respect, American policy analysts and German think tanks are united in a very bad way in their insistence on Mr. Putin's world of geopolitics and geoeconomics. So let me conclude with a few thoughts here, and then we can talk about the questions that you might have. I first went to Russia in 1999. I remember the Chechen wars. I remember reading Anna Politkovskaya. I worked with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and human rights activists who had been in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. I think it's incredibly important for Ukrainians to understand Bosnian, Syrian, and Yemeni history. I think it's also crucial for Ukrainians to know something about the history of partitions. If we study the history of Crimea and the illegal, unlawful annexation of Crimea, it tells us something about the world that Mr. Putin is operating in. His Volksdeutsche, Ruski Mir, his attempt to, all of these are historical pretexts and not actual history, because actual history involves the study of grabs for land, settlements, grabs for land. To conclude these thoughts, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, major news outlets in 2014, they depicted the Ukrainian crisis not as a war and not as an annexation, but they defined it as a crisis. The difference between 2020 and 2014 is Ukrainian journalists, intellectuals, historians have, in my opinion, won the public relations struggle. The world of journalists is standing behind Ukraine, and it's not just Western journalists either. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that I'm posting from around the world in Swedish, German, Polish, English, French. And Ukrainian values are what I think journalists and people who support you in Kherson now understand, that Ukraine is not simply pipelines or ethnic groups. These maps, I think, are very frightening and very dangerous, and also in some ways funny, but in a terrifying way. This map, when it circulated by the artist Vasily Loshkin in Russian, was intended as a joke, shutka. But this map now in 2022, I think is tragedia. Conclusion. I am trying to get Russians to return to history, not geopolitics and not myth. Russia is not the center of the world. Ukraine is not Russia. Ukraine has its own values, history, and geopolitics. Ukraine, like Poland after 1795, is cursed by geography. Maps of Ukraine in the 20th century and 21st century tell us the history of famine, Holodomor, genocide, Shoah, and mass murder. Maps give us power against the denial of Ukrainian history. Maps will rebuild your cities. Maps will restore life. Maps will connect you in Ukraine, in Kherson, to us in the world. Thank you.